My sister-in-law slapped me at my own anniversary dinner in front of my own children because I served myself a plate of food before she had hers. "You forget your place in this family," she snapped, her hands still raised like she was proud of it. My husband looked away. He didn't stand up. He didn't say a single word in my defense. So I set down my fork, wiped my hands on the linen napkin I had ironed myself that morning, and I slapped her back harder without a shred of hesitation. Then I turned to the man I had loved since I was 22 years old and said, "A husband who cannot defend his wife in front of a room full of people does not deserve to remain her husband." I took my daughter's hand in one of mine and my son's hand in the other, and I walked out of the house I had paid for, still in the dress I bought for the occasion. 2 years later, the same family that told me to remember my place would be the ones learning in the hardest possible way exactly what theirs was. My name is Jocelyn Calloway, and I grew up in a house with a circular driveway. My father built half the office parks in our county from nothing but a construction loan and pure stubbornness. I never wanted for anything material growing up. What I wanted, the one thing money couldn't buy me, was a love that felt like it belonged to me and not to a spreadsheet. Not arranged, not brokered, not chosen for the sake of a merger between two families with matching bank accounts. I found that love in Grantham Thorne when I was 22 in a coffee shop 3 blocks from my college apartment on an ordinary rainy Tuesday that somehow became the beginning of everything. He was nothing like the polished men my mother paraded past me at country club luncheons. Grantham drove a car with 200,000 meters on it and worked long on glamorous hours at a mid-sized architecture firm sketching buildings he didn't yet have the seniority to design himself. He made me laugh so hard that first afternoon that I spilled my drink across the table and onto both of us. Neither of us cared. We talked for 4 hours. I missed a study group I'd promised to attend and didn't think about it once until the next morning. My father was skeptical of him. In that quiet way fathers are skeptical of men who show up without a resume attached to their name. My mother worried more than once that a man marrying into money sometimes learns to tolerate the woman for the sake of everything that surrounds her. I told her she was wrong. I was so certain back then. Standing in my parents' kitchen, defending a man I'd known for 8 months, that she simply didn't understand what I'd found. We married in a small ceremony my parents paid for in a garden behind my grandmother's old church. Grantham's family attended with a strange, watchful stiffness I mistook at the time for shyness. It wasn't shyness. It was calculation, quiet and patient, and I didn't yet have the vocabulary to recognize it for what it was. Grantham's mother, Finanella, ran her household like a court in miniature. His older sister, Wilhelmina, was the uncontested crown princess of it, unmarried, financially dependent on the family catering business. As Vanilla's late husband had left behind, and quietly resentful of anyone who threatened to shift the family's center of gravity even an inch. I was that threat, whether I intended to be or not. A woman with her own money, her own opinions, and a husband who, in those early years, actually looked at me like I mattered more than his sister's approval. That didn't last nearly as long as I wanted. It too. I remember the first real crack clearly, because I've replayed it so many times since. It was our second Thanksgiving as a married couple. I had spent the entire day cooking a meal from a recipe card in my late grandmother's handwriting. Wilhelmina picked at the stuffing, set down her fork with a small, deliberate clink against the china, and set to the table at large. It's sweet when some people try so hard to prove they belong somewhere they clearly weren't born into. Everyone laughed, the small, uncomfortable laugh people give when they know exactly what was meant and choose not to acknowledge it. Grantham reached for the gravy boat and changed the subject to football. I sat there holding my water glass too tightly and said nothing. The next year, at my son Callahan's christening, Finanella cornered me near the coat closet while I was still holding my newborn son. In the gentlest possible voice, she told me that money can buy a beautiful nursery. Dear, but it can't buy manners. And she did worry sometimes about what our grandchildren would absorb from being around it so much. I stood there rocking my infant son and said nothing back. I had already learned by then that arguing only made the room colder for days afterward, and Grantham never once thought it back out on his own. There was another moment 2 years later at Finanella's birthday. I had quietly covered the entire catering bill after Wilhelmina's business, the same one that was supposedly thriving, came up short on funds at the last minute. Nobody thanked me. Wilhelmina simply remarked loud enough for the caterers themselves to hear that it was nice Joseline finally found a use for all that family money besides decorating. I laughed along that night because laughing along had become its own quiet survival skill. There were dozens of these moments scattered across the years, small, precise cuts delivered with a smile, always in front of an audience large enough to make any response feel like an overreaction. Always followed by my husband's particular brand of silence. Not agreement, just a steady refusal to spend even a single ounce of his own comfort defending mine. I told myself year after year that it was worth it. Love meant absorbing a few sharp words for the sake of family unity, for the sake of my children having grandparents, for the sake of the man I had chosen over every safer option my parents had once quietly lined up for me. I told myself a great many things over 11 years of marriage. Every single one of them was a small, necessary lie so I could keep loving him without the resentment eating me alive. We had 2 children by then, my daughter Beatrix, 7 and sharp as a blade, and my son Callahan, 5, who worshipped his father with the uncomplicated devotion only small boys seemed capable of. I had built a career of my own, too, running a boutique interior design firm that had over the years quietly started to eclipse Grantham's income from the architecture firm. I never rubbed that in his face. I never made him feel small for it, not even in the months I covered the entire mortgage on my own, because my design work kept me traveling often, site visits, client installations, buying trips out of state. Grantham had naturally taken over most of our day-to-day banking somewhere along the way, a small practical arrangement that felt like teamwork at the time. I just kept smoothing over every awkward silence his family created because I believed a marriage was a thing you protected, even in the years it had clearly stopped protecting you back. The house we lived in, a colonial with a wraparound porch that Wilhelmina loved to comment on as though she owned some invisible share of it, had been purchased with help from my side of the family. My father covered the down payment as a wedding gift, and I funded every renovation since, room by room, with money I earned myself. On paper, the house belonged to both Grandam and me equally. In practice, Finanella and Wilhelmina treated it like a Thorne family asset I was merely being permitted to live inside of, provided I behaved myself and remembered whose name carried more weight at that table. I didn't yet understand how literally they meant that last part. Our 11th wedding anniversary fell on a Saturday in early autumn. I wanted for once to celebrate it the way I remembered our very first years. Warm, unguarded, entirely ours. Grantham asked the week before if his mother and sister could join us just this once because it would mean something to Finanella to be included, because I was, even after everything, still trying. I said yes. I spent 3 days preparing that dinner. Roasted chicken with rosemary and lemon, a wild rice dish my mother taught me as a girl, a chocolate tour I'd practiced twice before getting the texture right. I set the table myself. I pressed the linens myself. I picked fresh flowers from my mother's garden that morning. Finanella arrived first, trailing her fingers along the linen the way a woman audits a business she's never trusted to succeed. Wilhelmina arrived 20 minutes late, exactly as she always did, and settled into the seat at the head of a table that Grantham quietly let her have in our house on our anniversary without a glance in my direction. I let it go. I always let it go. When the food was ready, I served the children first, moving quickly so nothing would go cold. Then, at last, I served myself and sat down. I had barely lifted my fork when Wilhelmina's open hand crossed the table and struck my cheek. My ears rang. My vision blurred white at the edges for a full second. "You forget your place in this family," she said. It was loud enough that Beatrix's fork clattered against her plate. Callahan froze mid-bite. The room went silent except for my own pulse behind my eyes. I looked at Grantham. I looked at the man I had married for love, the man whose family I had fed and funded and quietly forgiven for 11 straight years. He looked down at his own plate, as though the tablecloth held something more urgent than his wife's serene face. Something in me that had been cracking slowly for over a decade finally gave way. I set down my fork. I wiped my hands on my napkin slowly. The way you move when your body needs a moment to catch up with a decision your mind has already made. Then I reached across the table and struck Wilhelmina back with a full weight of 11 years of silence behind it. The gas that traveled around the table almost made me laugh, as if I were the one who had broken some sacred rule. I stood up. I looked at Grantham, not Wilhelmina, not Fenelahim, and said the words that had been sitting coiled in my chest for years. A husband who cannot defend his wife in front of a room full of people does not deserve to remain her husband. He didn't argue, he didn't apologize. He sat there stunned, like a man who had never once considered that his silence might carry a cost. I took Beatrix's hand in mine, Callahan's in the other, and walked both of my children out of that dining room, out of that house, and into my car, still wearing the dress I bought for the two of us. I drove straight to my parents' home, 40 minutes away. My mother opened the door before I even knocked, took one look at my face and said, "Come in, baby, you're safe here now." My parents' house had always felt like a fortress of a different kind. Not the sort built to keep me in line, but the sort built to keep me protected. My mother made up the guest wing for me and the children within a single day, without asking how long we might be staying. My father hugged me tightly enough that I felt for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, entirely unafraid. Grantham called that night, then the next morning, then every few hours after that, until my phone buzzed nearly hot in my pocket. I let most of it go to voicemail. When I finally answered, 3 days later, sitting alone on my parents' back porch, he was full of the kind of apology that comes dressed up as love, but is really just fear of consequence. I should have said something. I know that now. "I'm sorry. We can fix this. My family will apologize. Please just come home. The kids need their father." I asked him one question. "How many times, Grantham, how many times over 11 years have you watched your mother or your sister humiliate me at my own table and said absolutely nothing?" He didn't have an answer because we both already knew it by heart. Too many to count. I had stopped counting somewhere around year 4 because counting made it far too painful to keep staying. In those first strange quiet weeks, I leaned harder than I expected on my business partner, Hien, a steady woman who had built the design firm alongside me from a 2-esque office into something that now employed 11 people. She showed up on my parents' porch the Sunday after the dinner with takeout and no questions, sat with me while the children napped and said, "I've watched you carry that family for a decade. Whatever you decide now, the firm carries you." It was such a small thing to say, and it undid me completely because it was the first time in years. Someone had told me I was allowed to be carried instead of doing all the carrying myself. I filed for divorce 11 days after the anniversary dinner. I hired an attorney named Barnaby Coyle, a sharp, unflappable man my father had trusted for decades of business dealings. I told him plainly what I wanted, my children, my house, and the truth about what that family had actually been doing to us for over a decade. By then, a quiet suspicion had formed that there was more than cruelty hiding underneath vanilla, and Wilhelmina's contempt. I suspected there was money involved somewhere. I was right, though I had no idea yet how deep it went or how long it would take to fully untangle. It was Barnaby who found it first. buried in the financial disclosures required for the divorce. Over the past 4 years, more than $60,000 had moved out of our joint household account in small, irregular transfers, never large enough on their own to raise a flag, and easy to miss given that Grantham had handled most of our monthly banking for years, while my work kept me on the road. The money had gone to Wilhelmina, not as gifts, as loans that were never repaid, funneled quietly through Grantham to keep his sister's catering business afloat. A business Finanella had bankrolled for years and refused to let die, even as it bled money behind a polished storefront. Grantham had signed off on these transfers using an account I had funded almost entirely with my own earnings without ever telling me where the money actually went. That discovery, painful as it wasn't the worst of it. Buried deeper in the paperwork was a notarized quitclaim form dated 18 months earlier attempting to transfer a 10% ownership stake in our house. The house my own father had helped me buy into Finanella's name. My signature sat at the bottom of the page in ink I had never put there. Barnaby brought in a forensic document examiner who flagged inconsistent pressure patterns and pen lift points that didn't match my genuine signature on file with our mortgage lender. It was a convincing forgery, but not a perfect one. Barnaby was careful to warn me even then not to expect a fast resolution. A forgery case like this, he said, would need to move through the recorder's office, then possibly a criminal referral. And that kind of process rarely moves quickly, no matter how strong the evidence looks on day one. The county recorder's office confirmed something that stopped me cold. Their own routine verification process had actually flagged the transfer months earlier and quietly held it pending documentation that was never provided. It had never fully gone through. But the attempt itself was real, deliberate, and according to Barnaby, very likely a criminal matter that the district attorney's office would need months, not weeks, to properly evaluate. Barnaby walked me through what that timeline would actually look like, sitting across his desk with a legal pad covered in small, careful handwriting. The recorder's office would need to formally document the flag transfer and hand over their internal records. A detective from the Financial Crimes Unit would need to interview the notary who had processed the form to determine whether she had been deceived or was somehow complicit. Bank records tied to the original notarization fee would need to be subpoenaed. None of it, he told me plainly, would move at the pace of the divorce itself, which was already moving faster than most. I remember nodding along in his office, absorbing the idea that I might spend the next several years of my life still hearing updates about this case, and scattered phone calls long after the custody paperwork was signed and the moving boxes were unpacked. I remember calling my father that evening, sitting alone in my car in Barnaby's parking garage because I couldn't bring myself to say the words inside my parents' house, where the children might overhear. My father listened without interrupting, the way he'd always listened when I was small, and when I finally finished, he said only, "You built that house with your own 2 hands as much as any contractor did. Nobody takes that from you while I'm still breathing. It wasn't a legal strategy, it was simply what I needed to hear." Then Barnaby found a second thread, one none of us expected. Cross-referencing county records out of habit, he discovered Finella had attempted a nearly identical quitclaim maneuver once before, decades earlier, against her own late husband's sister, in a property dispute that had quietly settled out of public view. This wasn't a single lapse in judgment. It was a pattern she had simply been waiting for the right, unwatched moment to repeat. There was one more piece, and it came from a place I never expected. A former employee of Wilhelmina's catering business, a young woman named Odessa who had quit 2 years earlier after going unpaid for a month, reached out to Barnaby's office once word of the investigation quietly reached her. She had kept copies of invoices she'd once been asked to inflate for family events, including my own anniversary dinner, so a portion of what I'd paid could be quietly redirected. It was a small amount compared to everything else, but it confirmed something I had begun to suspect all along. Nothing about that family's warmth toward me had ever been entirely what it appeared to be. Odessa told Barnaby, almost as an afterthought during their second conversation, that she had watched Wilhelmina do the same thing to at least one other client over the years, a wedding client who had never realized the final invoice didn't match what had actually been delivered. Barnaby noted it for the record, though it never became part of our case directly. It simply confirmed one more time that this had never been a single lapse in judgment born out of desperation. It was simply how that family operated when they thought no one outside it was paying close enough attention. The next 2 years unfolded slower than I wanted and in some ways faster than I feared. Barnaby referred the forged quitclaim to the district Attorney's Financial Crimes Unit and the Recorder's Office cooperated fully, providing their internal flag records as evidence the filing had been caught before completion. Grantham, confronted with the transfer records, insisted he hadn't known about the forgery itself, only about the loans to his sister, which he still called helping family. As though 11 years of my quiet generosity hadn't already been exactly that, given freely without ever once being asked to sign anything away. I didn't fully believe him. By that point, it no longer mattered to me whether I did. The custody proceedings moved forward on the strength of a pattern I hadn't realized I had been documenting for years. Photographs, calendar entries, and messages showing I had managed every school event, every doctor's appointment, every midnight fever, while Grantham consistently deferred to his mother's opinions about how our children should be raised. The court awarded me primary custody with a structured parenting schedule for Grantham and a requirement that he complete a full accounting of where the missing $60,000 had gone before certain visitation terms would be finalized. Beatrix struggled more than Callahan did in those early months, old enough to sense something had fundamentally shifted, but too young to have words for it. She asked me once, curled against my side on the sofa, whether it was her fault, whether serving her own plate too had somehow made things worse that night. I held her face in both my hands and told her that nothing about that dinner had ever been about a plate. It had been about a woman who needed someone smaller than her to feel powerful over, and that was never for 1 second anything Beatrix had done wrong. Callahan, in his own 5-year-old way, just asked when he'd get his own room back. I promised him a version of home that didn't exist yet, but that I intended to build regardless. By the second year, both children had settled into a new rhythm that felt, to my quiet relief, almost entirely ordinary. Beatrix joined a soccer team at her new school and came home most afternoons talking more about a girl named Priscilla on her team than about anything that had happened at that dinner table. Callahan stopped asking about his old room altogether once his new one filled up with the same dinosaur posters and half-broken toy trucks he'd always loved. And I realized, watching him build an entire city out of couch cushions one Saturday afternoon, that children absorb far more resilience from a stable home than they ever do from a complicated one held together by silence. The house, my house, was restored fully to my name once the forensic examiner's report was accepted by the family court, and Finanella's ownership claim was formally voided by the county. The criminal referral against her moved slower, exactly as Barnaby had warned me it would. As of this telling, the district attorney's office is still building that case, and Barnaby says matters like this can take years before anyone sees the inside of a courtroom. The civil result, though, is already done. Grantham, rather than fight a fraud investigation that would have pulled his mother and sister further into it, agreed to a settlement that included full restitution of the diverted funds, paid in structured installments. Wilhelmina's catering business folded within the first year of the family, finally cutting off money that had never truly been theirs to give away. A handful of her longtime clients later told mutual acquaintances that they'd suspected something was off about her billing for years, but had never wanted to be the one to raise it publicly. Vanilla, facing the real possibility of her own exposure over both the recent quit-claim attempt and the decades-old pattern Barnaby had unearthed, retreated from any further contact with me entirely, not out of remorse, I suspect, but out of fear of what continued proximity might now cost her. Word traveled through the extended family quietly, the way it always does. My father's older brother, a retired judge who had always kept a polite distance from Grantham's side of the family, called me directly once he heard about the quick claim and told me he had never trusted Finanella's warmth, not once in all the years he'd watched her operate at family gatherings. Grantham's own younger cousin, a soft-spoken man named Desmond, who had always been kind to me in the background, sent me a short, private message once the story became impossible for the family to keep quiet. He said he was sorry, that he had noticed things over the years and never said a word. I appreciated it even as I recognized it for what it was. Another version of the same silence I had lived inside of for 11 years, just arriving more gently and far too late to change anything. Somewhere in the middle of that second year, while the criminal referral sat quietly in a queue at the district attorney's office and the custody schedule finally settled into a rhythm that children could count on, I noticed something shift in myself that I hadn't expected. My design firm grew faster in those 2 years than it had in the previous 5 combined. Clients started asking gently why my work suddenly felt bolder, less careful, less concerned with pleasing every possible taste in a room. I didn't have a clever answer for them. I just knew that a version of me who no longer spent half her energy managing someone else's family had a great deal more energy left over for everything else. Grantham asked to see me once more before the divorce was finalized. He sat across from me in Barnaby's conference room, older somehow than he looked 2 years earlier, and said the words I once years ago would have given almost anything to hear. I'm sorry for all of it. I should have chosen you every single time, and I didn't. I believed in the moment that he meant it, but an apology offered only after the money is found and the papers are signed isn't repentance. It's damage control, arriving years too late to mean what it might once have meant. I had spent 11 years forgiving smaller versions of that same silence, hoping each time the next slight would be the one that changed him. The anniversary dinner had simply been the last straw on a decade-long pile of them, and I was done handing out forgiveness for free. I know, I told him quietly, but I'm not the same woman who kept forgiving you for it. I have no interest in going back to being her. The divorce was finalized on a gray Tuesday. I walked out of that courthouse holding both of my children's hands, the same way I had walked them out of that dining room 2 years earlier. Except this time, I wasn't running from anything. I was walking toward the rest of our lives in a house that finally fully belonged only to us. He threw a small dinner for me and the children the week the divorce finalized. Nothing elaborate, just her own kitchen table crowded with mismatched chairs and too much food. But it was the first anniversary of any kind I'd celebrated in years, where every person at the table actually wanted me there. I served myself first that night without thinking twice. Nobody so much as blinked. My mother sat across from me that evening, watching my children argue happily over the last dinner roll, and told me quietly that she hadn't seen me laugh that easily in over a decade. She was right, and I hadn't even noticed the difference in myself until she said it out loud. Beatrix asked me recently why Aunt Wilhelmina doesn't come to her birthday parties anymore. I told her the truth in words a 7-year-old could carry. Some people forget that love isn't something you're allowed to take for granted just because someone keeps giving it freely. Sometimes the people who love us most have to be the ones who finally teach them where that giving stops. I think about that dinner often, not the slap itself. I have never regretted returning it. I think about the silence that came right before it. 11 years of silence from the one person who was supposed to stand between me and a room full of people trying to put me in my place. I learned in the end that the place I truly belonged was never at the foot of someone else's table, waiting for my turn to be fed scraps of respect.